All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Today is Friday, February 25th. I'm Donna Will, Professional Development Coordinator for DDA. We welcome you to the Rate Review Advisory Group Kickoff. Before we begin, I'm going to go over a few things about the webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options for listening to the webinar, by computer or by phone, and if you have trouble hearing, you can switch by going to the audio section and click on either computer or phone to switch. We will be recording the webinar and posting this session on the DDA website. There'll be a dedicated page for that, and they'll go over more about that later on in the webinar. So now I'd like to introduce Robert White. Hi, Robert.
Hi, thank you, Donna, and thank you all for joining us today for the first meeting of the Rate Review Advisory Group. My name is Robert White, and I'm the Director of Administrative Services for the Developmental Disabilities Administration. The Maryland Department of Health extends a warm welcome to the Rate Review Advisory Group members, as well as members of the public who are present. The DDA Rate Review Advisory Group is a critical component of the DDA annual rate review process. This process will align with other Medicaid rate reviews and will initiate an open structure to support in-depth reviews of rates, rate components, and policies impacting rate operationalization. Please take a moment to view the meeting agenda, and if you have any questions or comments, you may use the chat feature. Questions or comments from members of the observing public will be recorded, but may not be responded to during this meeting. Advisory group members are welcome to unmute and speak as needed, and we will introduce all members in just a few minutes. Next slide. Today's meeting marks the launch of this new structure, which comes from Secretary Schrader's and Deputy Secretary Simon's commitment to the development of adequate and sustainable rates that promote the vision and the mission of the DDA community. This advisory group ensures an open and transparent process to review rates while leveraging the effective structure and experiences of other Maryland Department of Health rate processes. Next slide. The DDA is guided by 6 essential focus areas for community living so that people with developmental disabilities will have full lives in their communities where they are included and can participate and are active citizens. These focus areas are employment, self-determination, technology, self-direction, supporting families, and supported housing. On behalf of Deputy Secretary Simons, who is unable to be with us today unexpectedly, he remains very proud of our DD community and our provider partners who have pushed our services and focus areas forward through innovation, flexibility, and an unwavering commitment to person-centered practice. We have worked hard as a community to design new waiver services, building from your innovation and deep commitment to everyone we serve. As we work together on our rate setting priorities, we ask that we make sure our recommendations reflect our shared values. Next slide. Thank you again to all participants for your time and contributions to this important process. This advisory group was created under the direction of Secretary Schrader as part of his commitment and investment of dedicated Maryland Department of Health resources to ensure a rate setting process that is transparent, data informed, and responsive to our provider and disability community needs. This slide shows the language of this group's charter, which is to provide a formal, consistent, and unified approach for stakeholders of the Developmental Disabilities Administration to provide guidance on the development of Medicaid payment rates for services provided through home and community-based services waiver programs. This new rate review structure provides for the review and adjustment of selected rates on an annual basis. A more comprehensive review of all rates and services will occur through this structure every 3 to 5 years. And this is called a rebase. Currently, we are in a rate review year, which means that this advisory group can inform the rate review priorities for the Maryland Department of Health decision and analysis. Next slide. This timeline displays the work of this current rate review advisory group alongside the state of Maryland's fiscal year milestones. Targeted dates for group decisions are anchored in the Maryland Department of Health's operating budget cycle, and we can insert that link into the chat so that you all have access to it. Beginning in January and continuing into February of 2022, the Maryland Department of Health began consolidating the rate setting process for services provided through the developmental disability Medicaid waivers, and the current process for all other Medicaid funded services under one office. The launch of this 10-member rate review advisory group builds in a strategic opportunity for representatives of key stakeholder groups to engage as advisors in detailed dialogue with the Maryland Department of Health, DDA, the Hilltop Institute at UMBC, and its contracted actuaries, Optimus. I'll turn it over now to my colleague, Jennifer Mclavey, Director of Finance, Medicaid, to sketch out more of the details of this advisory body. Jennifer?
All right. Thank you, Robert, and good afternoon, everyone. So I join Robert in thanking all of you for agreeing to participate in this process as members. The rate review process that Robert has outlined is intended to ensure the outcomes that you should be seeing on the next slide, please. On this slide, which are that stakeholders understand the process by which rates are reviewed and feedback is collected, adherence to a structured timeline to support timely rate reviews or adjustments, timely processes for the collection and review of feedback to enable long-term development and maintenance of DDA rates, stronger consistency in Medicaid rate setting processes, and making sure we have a strong program and are good stewards of public funds. Next slide, please. The 10-member advisory group has a combination of reserved, designated, and open seats. 3 seats are reserved for industry representatives, and 1 seat is reserved for a representative of SDAN with experience and expertise in self-directed service budgets and delivery of services. Of the reserved industry seats, 2 are designated for members of the Statewide Association of Service Provider Agencies, representing approximately 100 providers, the Maryland Association of Community Services. There's 1 open seat for a person who brings knowledge and expertise of how policy, rates, and service definitions should align to drive the system, 1 seat for a user of DDA services, and 4 additional open seats for industry representatives. Seats are designed to ensure a broad cross-section of stakeholders with experiences in managing, providing, or accessing services would be at the table, including identifying a self-advocate engaged in a network or networks of other people with disabilities. To solicit membership for this group, DDA created an online application for interested individuals to submit their name for consideration. A broadly broadcasted constant contact email with the link to the application went out to agencies, families, and individuals on January 20th, with a second notice on January 26th, and applications closed on January 28th. In response, 60 applications were received and 8 seats needed to be filled. All applications were reviewed and considered for selections, ensuring a representation of a wide array of services and diverse stakeholders across the regions. The result is a seated membership which collectively covers the state and covers the full array of services. The providers collectively serve almost 1,500 people, ranging from 77 individuals served to over 350 across the provider agencies. And this slide displays the names of all currently selected members. At this time, I would like to invite the selected members to introduce themselves. Members of the public can also introduce themselves through the chat box if they would like.
Jennifer, do you want us to just jump in?
Yeah, why don't we go with the order on the slide, just so we don't have folks talking over each other. So Laura, we'll start with you.
Great, and thanks. I'm Laura Howell, the Executive Director of MACS, the Maryland Association of Community Services.
Hi, this is Sharon Lewis. I am a consultant with Health Management Associates, and my colleague Maria Dominiak and I will be supporting MACS through this process.
I'm Carol Custer. I'm with the Self-Directed Advocacy Network of Maryland, and I am their secretary, and we're here to make sure self-direction is included in this. Thank you.
I'm Donna Retzloff, Executive Director of Springdale Center and a MACS member.
Good afternoon. I'm Karen Adams-Gilchrist, CEO and President of Providence Center and a MACS member.
Waiting for Ken, but in the meantime, I'm Scott Hollingsworth. I'm with Appalachian Crossroads in Garrett County.
Hi, Karen Lee from SEEK. I'm also an early adopter.
Good afternoon, Christian Parks, consultant for Somerset Community Services.
Good afternoon. My name is Shauna Mulcahy, and I'm the Executive Director with the ARC of Frederick County.
And good afternoon. This is Greg Miller. I'm the President and CEO at Penmore Human Service and also an early adopter and a member of MACS.
Great, thanks everyone. Do we have Ken on the call? Why don't we continue to our next slide, please? All right. So I wanted to talk a bit more about our process for selecting the members of the group. The criteria for defining seats was developed with input from internal and external stakeholders, including advice from the Hilltop Institute and Optimus, who are contractors for both Medicaid and DDA. Hilltop and Optimus also shared with Maryland Department of Health information about other states who have established similar rate-focused stakeholder groups to address developmental disabilities rates. The Secretary will regularly review the membership and membership criteria to ensure membership remains in line with the role of the Rate Review Advisory Group. Some seats are predetermined to ensure representation from key stakeholder groups, and MDH selected the individuals based on the following criteria. The individual or agency is representative of the current provider network. The individual or agency is engaged in utilizing and operationalizing inclusive community-based services, and the individual can meet attendance expectations, review materials, and engage others within their network or organization to support them in this process. Our next slide, please.
Jennifer, this is Carrie.
Yes.
Sorry to jump in. I think Ken was going to try to introduce himself. So just before we move on, I just wanted to go back. Ken, I can unmute your mic if that's helpful, or if we want to put you on camera. See if that will work. Why don't I do this? I'll work with Ken. I know we didn't get a chance to test his mic before we started. So let me work with Ken. And then once I'm able to get him synced up with the video and the audio, I'll ping back in and let you know.
Sounds good.
Thanks, sorry about that.
No problem. So now we just want to review the roles and responsibilities of advisory group members. So those roles and responsibilities are reviewing utilization data for some or all services and assisting in crafting stakeholder interview questions, depending on whether we're in a review or a rebasing year, providing input to guide MDH decisions on which services to review during the course of the calendar year, sharing relevant information and experience from stakeholders providing or receiving services, reviewing and providing input on proposed changes to service definitions, rate models, or policies. Next slide, please. And for MDH, our roles and responsibilities are to coordinate and facilitate a transparent process, solicit information to set rate priorities and inform decisions, identify and obtain the data sources and data sets to help evaluation and work on priorities, doing the actual analysis and sharing, presenting to the group, ensuring CMS requirements are followed and that we're following an approved methodology, and assessing the budget impact and that our process aligns with the state budget process. Next slide, please. Having a shared understanding of the relationship between the various entities responsible for rate setting is a helpful foundation. The two central entities are Maryland Department of Health overall, which includes the Medicaid Office of Finance, where I'm the Director of Finance for Medicaid. The Developmental Disabilities Administration is also part of the Maryland Department of Health, and its Office of Change Management supports the coordination of this rate setting advisory group. MDH overall and DDA are the primary decision makers for rate setting. Hilltop Institute at UMBC and its contracted rate setting consultant Optimus provide broader long-term maintenance of Developmental Disability Administration rates. These entities invite the broader community to submit comments and or participate in regularly scheduled meetings throughout the year. Following me, you'll hear from representatives from Optimus to provide an overview of the CMS approved rate setting methodology and a summary of known rate setting priorities. And this rate setting advisory group acts as a double feedback loop to both DDA and MDH overall to provide guidance on the development of Medicaid payment rates for services provided through home and community-based services waiver programs. And at this time, I will ask Steve Schramm with Optimus to share more about the CMS requirements for DDA rate setting.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Schramm with Optimus. We are the rate setting consultants. We have worked in Maryland in one shape or another since the early 2000s, initially working on the rate setting as a partner with the Hilltop Institute at UMBC on the health choice rates, and then about 4 years ago began to do work for DDA as part of their rate setting process. If we could go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about the requirements for the rate setting. So we've all been involved in the DD community for a number of years. Optimus has approximately a half dozen state DD entities, either agencies or subdivisions that we consult with across the country. And we've seen the evolution of the treatment of rate setting in the DD environment. A major sea change happened with the HCBS setting rule, which really brought to the forefront this idea that the rate setting process should be something that is updated regularly, as well as a collaborative process. So you see on this slide, the requirement from CMS is that the rate setting methodology by service needs to be reviewed at a minimum every 5 years. What we've talked about in our conversations with DDA and with MDH is that it would be really helpful if we could have a regular series of interactions with the key stakeholders in the Maryland DD community so that we can get regular feedback on how the rates are working at the operational level from a provider's perspective, but also at the individual level, how the individuals that are receiving DD services are faring under the rate methodology. Because at the end of the day, that is the most important group that we are focused on, ensuring, as Robert said at the very beginning, that these individuals have the opportunity to be engaged members of the community, and an appropriate rate setting methodology is very, very important for that goal to be achieved. When we talk about the rate process, there are a couple of steps that CMS has required states to include. So one of the things that must be laid out is when the rates were first set, and then how much time has elapsed since they've been reviewed. As part of our conversations with MDH and DDA, we asked for a regular cadence to communicate with stakeholders, similar to the process that works in the Health Choice program. And out of that came this rate review advisory group. In addition to laying out how the rates were initially set and when they were last reviewed, states need to measure this idea of rate sufficiency and compliance with Section 1902A30A. What that is getting at is the idea that the rates are able to develop sufficient access to care for the provider community to meet the needs of the individuals. There are a whole series of steps and processes associated with that. That was a very high level summation of 1902A30A. We can talk in future meetings about some of the components associated with that. As part of the rate review process, CMS requests that the state communicate what was the method that they used for the rate review and how often the rate review process works. So later on in the presentation, I'm going to hand off to two members of my team, Chris Welch and Leslie Lee, and they're going to talk about components of the rate review methodology. I'm going to transition to the next slide and talk a little bit about an overview of the rate review activities and how they fit from a timing perspective. So let's move to the next slide. So what we're trying to do here, so it goes from the left-hand side down, and then you transition back up to the top of the right-hand side. What we're trying to do here is outline a general description of the process that will happen on an annual basis. Now, you'll notice that we show this starting in January of 2022. We recognize that the first meeting we're having today is in February, but we wanted to give you an idea of how this would work in years going forward. And so we tried to map it out as if we were starting in January. The intent of providing this process and flow chart description is so that members of the rate review advisory group can understand the cadence of their participation in the process and allow people to begin preparing their network of individuals, their organizations, to more effectively participate in the rate review advisory group process. So an example of that is, as part of the February meeting, as well as the March meeting, we're going to be soliciting from members of the rate review advisory group an issues list to help us identify what are the most important issues that we're going to try to address within not only this rate setting cycle, but also future rate setting cycles. One of the most important things that we want to communicate as part of today's conversation is that this is an ongoing process, and there will be issues that we're able to identify and denote as a priority, but they may not be addressed in the current rate setting process. They may be tabled and addressed in future rate setting processes. We want the process to be one of active engagement. And so our expectation is that you, as a member of the advisory group, will represent your group and the interests of the larger DD community and give us feedback on what are the critical issues that need to be addressed during the rate setting process for that February meeting. In March, the meeting will shift, and what we'll be talking about then is, if we have these rate setting issues and we've prioritized them, how do they potentially modify the rates going forward? We understand that there are some issues that may be brought up that don't immediately impact or require modifications to the rates. And we also understand that there will be some issues that are brought up that members of the rate review advisory group would like to see modifications in the next rate setting cycle. And so what we're going to try to do is differentiate between the current rate setting cycle and any future rate setting cycles. As part of the conversations in February and March about the issues and potential modifications, we'll also be talking with the rate review advisory group members, as well as soliciting feedback from the public about data and the availability of those data to help us quantify any of the potential issues and modifications to the rate methodology. It's very important that we use as much data as possible in order to look at the issues that are being raised and drive any potential modifications to the rates. In April of 2022, and this will be in April of the typical process, what we'll be trying to do is begin to present to the rate review advisory group some of the preliminary analyses that have come out of the issues list and potential modifications to the rates. In those meetings, what we're planning on doing is providing information before the meetings so that you, as members of the rate review advisory group, can look at that information and be prepared to discuss it based on your interaction within your organization and your network, as Jennifer said, in your role as a rate review advisory group member. When we talk a little bit later, Chris will talk about the rate setting process. There's a very important step, and this happens in May of the process that we've mapped out, where what we're trying to do is look at trend that is ongoing within the DDA program. And when we talk about trend, what we mean is the differences in the program between the time period that we have historical information, the current time period, and then the future time period that we are projecting those rates forward for. So the idea of trend is to look at changes that have happened between the base data time periods, the current time period that we are in, and the projected contract time period in the future. Again, we want this to be an interactive process, and so you see that in May we're going to present draft trends, and then in June we will come back and present the final recommended trends. Once we've made it through this June time period, we begin to transition the process more into the budget process that Robert was talking about. We now need to have our rate setting process intersect with the MDH rate setting process and their interaction with budget on the proposed rates. And so we're beginning to get feedback at the state level in July on the proposed rates. And then in August and September, we're beginning to finalize the rate setting process so that we can do the provider impact and budget simulations in the August and September timeframe, so that it is you as providers and you as the rate review advisory group are able to see the financial impact of the proposed rate changes. Now, what I've done is I've walked through a general rate review process and flow chart timeline. There will be differences as we go through this between rate review years and rate rebase years. We don't want to today get bogged down in differentiating between the rate review and the rate rebase years, but just understand that we are expecting to have a partnership with the rate review advisory group in receiving recommendations and feedback on issues that we need to look at for the rate setting methodology, potential modifications for the rate setting methodology that come out of those rates, recommendations about sources of data that we can utilize to quantify the potential issues list and modifications to the rates, then present those analyses to the rate review advisory group so that we can get feedback, begin to project some of those analyses forward into the contract period, and then receive feedback from the provider community about our proposed rates and the impact at both the individual provider level and the overall budget level, so that we can have this interactive annual process to constantly review and potentially update the rate methodology to ensure that the rates do provide the appropriate reimbursement for the provider community to meet the needs of the DD individuals within the Maryland system. And so with that, I'm going to hand it to Chris Welch from Optimus to give a little bit of background on rate development processes in general, and then some more specific background on the current rate methodology that's utilized in Maryland. Before I transition it to Chris, are there any questions about the overall process and flow that we have laid out here?
Steve, this is Greg from Penmore. I have a question. And as I listen to you walking through the process and the timeline of the process, my question is there going to be flexibility if something unimaginable happens between rebase years? For example, a global pandemic. Is our process going to be fluid to where we can engage actively when things like what we've experienced over the last 2 years happen and the marketplace has completely changed?
Sure. So, Jennifer, are you comfortable if I use an analogous situation from the health choice rate setting process?
Sure, that makes sense.
Sure. So, Greg, just to give you an idea, when we do rate development and the rates follow an annual cadence, what you're describing is what we would call an externality, something that has fundamentally changed the program. And so in the health choice program, as part of the regular cadence, we allow portions of the agenda to include discussions of things that were not previously anticipated. So, I will give you an example. While we talk about issues and modifications to the rates in February and March, it may be that something arises in the June or July timeframe that we actually discuss in those June and July timeframes and see if they have a material enough impact on the rates. So there is some flexibility within the rate methodology, but we do need to recognize that it does take time to potentially gather information and receive your feedback, but we want to recognize that there are some key issues that may need us to adapt the timeline. Is that helpful?
Yes, that's very helpful, Steve. And I think that, thank you.
Steve, it's Laura. I had a question. So can you speak to, since this year is a little different in that there is discussion of 23 and 24, can you just speak to kind of where in this process the, discussion recommendations around 23 are expected to happen?
So the 23 rates, the ones that are going to be effective, and just so that I'm following, I want to make certain, Laura, I'm going to address your question. When you say the 23 rates, are you talking about the rates that are going to be effective April 1 of 2022 and go through and into 23?
Sure. I mean, I think I'm really thinking of July 1, but if they're going to start April 1, then that is an even more question.
I think if I can help clarify, I think when we included FY23 on that earlier timeline you saw, I think the intention for that was the rate starting July 1, 2023. The remaining work on the rates that are currently intended to go into effect in April are being wrapped up through a separate process.
So where I'm going, Laura, I just want to make certain that I'm addressing which of the windows that we're talking about. And so just to help people, I'm fairly certain the rate review advisory group, individuals are comfortable with this delineation, but typically when we're talking about rates and we use state fiscal year designation, if we're talking about state fiscal year 23, those are the rates in effect from July 1 of 22 to June 30th of 23. And so I just want to make certain I'm understanding which time frame you're talking about, Laura, okay?
Sure, and I'm referencing, in light of what Jennifer just said, I'm just going to say I'm referencing the FY23 rates that begin July 1 of 2022.
Okay, so we have gone through the process to develop the state fiscal year 23 rates, which will be in effect July 1 of 2022. We are currently in the process of receiving the provider impact analyses. Our partners at Hilltop are working on the budget impact calculations. We are continuing to work through that process. And so if we are going to be discussing rates in the rate review advisory group, the primary focus of the rate review advisory group is going to be looking forward for the state fiscal year 24 rates to have a long enough time frame. If there are issues that are immediately needing to be addressed in this first unique year, because we have the compressed time frame, we have talked about the possibility of using the rate review advisory group. But as Jennifer mentioned, there are potential parallel processes that exist because we don't have the same amount of time available, and this cadence that you would see that's mapped out for the state fiscal year 24 rates.
So I do want to provide a quick clarification. So the reason we said on our earlier timeline FY23 and FY24 is because we acknowledged through the whole process to develop the rates going into effect in April that there were some priority issues that were tabled, and we do intend, as you'll see later in this meeting, to take a look at those issues. And as Steve said, because this is an unusual year, our first year of doing this process and trying to transition from the initial development of the rates, we are considering potentially implementing some of the things that we talked through for FY23.
So this is Donna. Just to confirm then, this panel will be looking at some of those specific issues? Or
yes, and we'll be going through that after we can finish some of this introductory material. There'll be some discussion of those issues that were identified and an opportunity to bring up other issues as well.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions before I hand it off to Chris to give a little background on rate development and then the specific methodology here? Okay. With that, I'm going to hand it to Chris Welch from Optimus, and if we could go to the next slide.
Hi, everyone. Chris Welch, consultant with Optimus. Been working with DDA on this project, like Steve mentioned, for the last 4 or so years, kind of intermittently, but wanted to give you guys a little bit of background on the process by which the rates are calculated. So we're going to get into a little bit more of kind of the math algorithm part of this. I promise there's not going to be too much algebra, so we'll try to keep it pretty simple and high level for now. So up to now, we've kind of been talking about the process that how we meet and discuss and present rate information, but this is a little bit more of steps of, how we're taking some data and turning it into rates. So the first slide here that we wanted to give context on, some of you may be familiar with this, some it might be new information, is the rate development process in general. So this is as it applies to these rates for DDA, as it applies to the health choice rates for that Medicaid coverage, and just in general, the rate setting process tends to be, pretty similar here. So kind of starting out, we're collecting some of that provider service data to create a base data set. And that the intent there is to understand exactly what's going on in the program. And so as part of doing that, our second step is organizing it into relevant categories like the populations, types of services, different cost components, things like that. And that helps us to make sure that we are interpreting the data appropriately. At step 3 there, we're working with providers and stakeholders to get feedback on our interpretation of the data as we're sharing it, making sure that we aren't missing anything, that we're not, over accounting anything, that we are categorizing things appropriately, that we're really getting an accurate picture of what's existing at this point in time. And the intent there is to use this as kind of a base starting point and move it forward through a series of various adjustments to project the expectations, going forward. So after we've kind of gotten this base data, we've organized it, we've made sure that we've accounted for everything appropriately. The next step is to make adjustments for things like changes in the programs, that maybe the population is shifting a little bit, or policy changes. So if there's new benefits, coverage changes, service definitions, things like that. But in addition to that, Steve kind of mentioned other adjustments, inflationary trends, emerging service costs, things like that, that are, a little bit outside of the program or may impact the program in general. So we want to account for how that data needs to be changed to better reflect, the expectations moving forward. And as part of that, we need to consider those administrative costs. We understand that there are the direct costs of providing services, but there are also administrative costs of being able to, run a business that's or an organization that is providing these services, and being able to kind of direct that in a reasonable way. And as Steve had discussed, part of the process here is receiving stakeholder feedback on the rates, where we are potentially seeing some issues in terms of whether things may be causing some concerns around underpayment or overpayment, or considerations that hadn't been met in the development of the rates previously. So that's generally the high-level rate development process that's used kind of at large. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll start getting into the specifics for the DDA rates here. So the DDA rates more specifically use a sort of wage model for rate development. This is a pretty common model, especially for HCBS or DD programs across the country. Certainly not the only one, but this is a fairly common one. And so we have here is a list of components and some examples of the components. And those examples are not intended in any way to be an exhaustive list, but the components, as you see, wages, employee-related expenses, et cetera, those are ways by which we can categorize that base data to better understand it. So just a quick walkthrough here of kind of the process that we're taking. If we look at a provider's general ledger or data that they provide, we can ideally split the various costs into each of those components, whether it's wages, employee-related expenses, facility, and start to look at how they relate to each other. So some examples of the components. Wages is generally going to be direct support professionals. Employee-related expenses are things like benefits, payroll, taxes, et cetera. Facility costs, an important thing that we'll point out here, I know we've discussed this with some of you before, per the Center of Medicaid and Medicare Services, CMS, room and board is not an allowable cost in development of the rates for residential services. So facility costs may be things for like day programs where that facility is part of the cost, in providing that service. Program support, these tend to be things, costs that are incurred by a provider in support of providing the service, but not directly providing the service. So examples here might be if there's medical staff that are needed, nurses, et cetera, or specialized equipment that might be needed in order to provide that service. There may be some supervision in there. There's various things kind of going to the program support. Training, this would be required DDA trainings for the various direct support professionals. Transportation, this could include the staff provided transportation, so that the time that the DSPs or other employees are providing that transportation, as well as the cost of vehicles and the general transportation costs related to that. And finally, general and administrative costs. These are, any typical business costs. You kind of can think of them not necessarily tied to providing DD services, but just general office kind of costs. And so the intent here is to capture all of the costs that are required in order to provide DD services from every provider and allocate them to one of these components so that we're accurately capturing every cost that's required to provide these services. There's a lot of nuance here. There's a lot of detail that we can kind of get in and out of. And as we get to talking to some of these changes in future meetings, that's where we'll dive into this a little bit deeper into what each of these things mean, how they relate to each other. But this is just kind of a high level. Our intent here is to capture all those costs and those components and be able to have a good picture of what it costs to provide the services. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll start looking at how this information gets used. And so this is kind of an example. All this information is just an example. This is not any specific provider or anything like that. You can see all the numbers there around it. But for example, if we were to look at a provider's expenses, we might see that wages account for $2.5 million of their expenses versus that ERE, that employee-related expenses, might be $800,000, and so on and so forth down the list until we get to the total of all their costs from their general ledger. Then this is for the wage model of rate development, which is what's going on here. We look at those costs relative to the wages. So for example, if you take the ERE, or that first line, let's say with wages is $2.5 million, and you divide it by $2.5 million, that's 100% of those costs. If you look at ERE relative to wages, you take that 800,000 and you divide it by the 2.5 million, you get about 32% of those costs. And so as you look at those percentages in percent of wages, it's not going to add up to 100%. It's really a relativity there. We're looking at how much do we spend on ERE relative to wages? How much do we spend on program support relative to wages? How much do we spend on training and transportation relative to wages? The goal here is then to kind of update wages, and since these percentages, these relativities are built in as kind of our starting point, every time you update a wage, the other components are also updated accordingly. The one that I'll point out that's a little bit different is that general and administrative, that G&A cost. This is the way G&A is generally handled kind of universally, is G&A is a percentage of the total, not a percent relative to wages. And so that one kind of has its own category there. So you would take that $700,000 for G&A expenses and divide it by the 5.4 million to get what that G&A percentage is. So the intent here is this is what a provider's general ledger kind of base data set might look like. We would compile these together to create an aggregate based data set of what it looks like for providers across the board. And again, working with individual providers, with stakeholders, with the group here, we'd want to make sure that first of all, we're not missing any costs there. So that 5.4 million, was there another tab that wasn't shown, or another service that wasn't included? We want to make sure that we're categorizing this. So is this a day service? Is this a residential service? Is this a mix of services? What kind of populations are being served here, so that we can then start to use this as our foundation for how we can make changes to develop expected costs moving forward. And so if we move on to that next slide, this is kind of how that gets used into moving things forward a little bit. So we've taken wages, we've looked at those percentages, so you can see those ones, those percentages kind of hold constant from that last slide where ERE is 32%, the program support is 40%, transportation is 16%, et cetera. And what we've done here is we've said, okay, we understand those percentages. We're developing a new expectation around what wages should be going forward. And again, all this is just kind of mock information. So we'll say, for example, that we would assume that a direct service provider for this specific service might be paid $15 per hour. So we put in that $15 and then we'd multiply it by the 32% for ERE to get to the $4.80. And what that's saying is for every $15 that you spend paying someone's wages, you also need to account for $4.80 to pay for their benefit costs or payroll taxes, et cetera. Similarly, that program support, we've got 40%. So we'd multiply that 40% by $15 and say that that's $6. So for every $15 you're spending on a staff for an hour, you'd also be needing to spend about $6. You're expected to spend about $6 there on nursing staff, on specialized equipment, on various other components there. And so you get to each of these components, building up what the various costs are kind of on an hourly basis. And finally, that G&A, you can see it's light gray there. It's done a little bit differently. So we'll take the subtotal of everything before G&A, we'll gross it up by that 12.9%, which we can get into the math a little bit later, you know, if that's a complicated issue. But we'll gross that up for the 12.9% to get to the hourly cost of $32.52. Again, this is all kind of mock information, so we're not saying that these are the right percentages for anything in particular. That hourly cost is essentially the intent there is to capture all the costs that a provider is expected to incur in order to provide service for an hour. And this then would be adjusted for things like the various units that exist for the various services. So in this example, we said, you know, maybe this is a 15-minute service. And so instead of being able to bill for $32.50 for every unit, they're going to end up billing $8.13, so a quarter of that hourly cost, so that on average, you'd get back to that $32 per hour cost, and that would essentially make the providers whole, that would cover the costs of the program. Again, we're getting into a really high level look here, and there's a lot more detail, so I just want to reassure you that as we go through looking at these specific issues and discussions that we want to have as a group, that we will provide additional context or detail on how these things are interacting or what changes may have been made. For example, the training here is listed at 0.8%, and so that's a known issue where training isn't always delineated clearly in providers' general ledgers. So it's usually rolled into wages or often rolled into wages and can be hard to split apart. And so as part of developing the rates, we've looked at what sort of training hours are required. We've looked at how much turnover, how many hours per week we expect people to work, what onboarding training looks like versus ongoing training, and made some adjustments there to increase training. So roughly speaking, instead of having that 0.8%, it's more like 8% or 10% increase. So that's the kind of thing where we'll take that base data and make sure we understand it appropriately. We'll look at how we need to adjust it to project what things look like going forward, and make those changes to try to best predict or settle what the costs would look like moving forward for the providers. So we have had ongoing discussions with DDA over the last few years. There's been a little bit of history of things moving back and forth. I'm not going to try to get into all the details of what's gone on when and where, but long story short, there's DDA asked us to review some rates that had been published or discussed as of at least last spring. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll start talking about some of the adjustments that we've looked into that we may have made since rates had been discussed with the groups in the past. So we can just skip over to that next slide there.
Chris?
Yep.
Chris, this is Carrie. I just wanted to, before we jump into that, I know some folks wanted to possibly raise hands or ask questions. So before we jump, do folks want to ask any questions?
Carrie, yes, Chris Parks, thank you. Chris, quick question for you. What is the state's plan for, having a mechanism for gathering the data that we're looking at for rebasing in future years in a format that providers are able to give in a timely fashion? Currently, we're using the cost report to give data to the state. I believe that that's going to have to change significantly, and I just want to go on record and making sure that that information or that mechanism that's created needs to be given to providers in advance of whatever fiscal year that we're looking to gather that data, because it's not just a matter of reporting it. In a lot of cases, providers are going to have to track it and record it separately, and they need to know that going into that fiscal year, not at the end of that fiscal year.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really helpful comment. I would say I think that the specifics of how that's intended to be collected are still being worked through, but that's the kind of feedback and input that we want to make sure that we're getting from you to make sure that we're getting the best information available, that we're providing the right level of detail and asking the right questions of providers so that we can best capture that. Steve, it looked like you might have wanted to say something there.
Yeah, Christian, we have worked with our partners at Hilltop to help design data input processes. And so we would look to get your feedback on the data that we are trying to capture. And then work collaboratively with Hilltop to make certain that we have appropriate mechanisms and enough lead time to capture that information. So we appreciate the feedback and the comment.
Can I ask a follow-up question to what Chris said, which is when you look back at the time frame, where in that slide would that kind of time for any data analysis fall?
So, Laura, if you're looking at what is slide 14, we can, in the February and March timeframe is when we anticipated having conversations with members of the rate review advisory group about what data would be available for any particular issue. And then in that February, March timeframe, soliciting the information and beginning the analyses.
But if April is the month for presenting preliminary results of analyses, it seems like a really short time frame.
So it depends. So let me take a step back. If we're talking about, for instance, Christian's example, where this might be at the macro level talking about cost report information, yes, absolutely. That's very detailed, very structured. That has a very long lead time. And that's the kind of information that I was talking about that we would need to work with our partners at Hilltop to design a very structured data input process and rate review process associated with that. If we're talking about the information in February and March, it will depend upon whether we're in a rate review year or a rate rebase year, but let's assume that we're in a rate review year. The idea is that we're having conversations with the rate review advisory group in the February and March timeframes, and we're deciding whether or not there is sufficient data available and how long it will take to pull that information. So without knowing the particular issue, I can't say whether April is too soon or is adequate time. It will vary depending upon the issue.
So this is Sharon. Can I just add I guess a little bit of color, a question here, because I feel like there's a little bit of a cart and horse question that I'm struggling with, which is if the role of the advisory is to prioritize issues of interest. It seems to me that it would be valuable for there to be data that informs that list of issues. And I know that there have been, through the prior processes and some of the work that Max and others have done in terms of concerns about the current rate structure, there have been things that have floated to the top for which there has not been data, right? So for example, back to the acuity question and moving from in a rate structure from something that is highly dependent upon an acuity determination for each person that then supports what rate is available to them to the new system. One of the things that came out of some of those conversations, to your question, Steve, about something very concrete, was the need to understand the impact of the rate changes as it relates to the differentiation in individual support needs. And so I guess the kind of the question I have when I'm looking at this screen and thinking about this is, what kind of data on an ongoing basis will be made available to the rate review group prior to finalizing and prioritizing issues of interest so that people are able to make informed decisions about what they think some of the priorities should be, whether that is data that Chris is talking about in terms of information that is delivered through a mechanism like the current templates that Hilltop's been working on, or otherwise. I think it's a question around kind of cart and horse in terms of how do people prioritize issues without data.
Well, so you all have brought up issues to us, and going back to my earlier comment about we need to differentiate between what issues and modifications we can do in this current rate setting cycle versus which ones need to be put out into future rate setting cycles. So Laura's question was spot on when she was trying to distinguish between what's going to happen in state fiscal year 23 versus state fiscal year 24, because that's going to be a process that this rate review advisory group goes through each year. We'll be discussing which of these do we think we have the time to deal with now, and getting at Christian's part about will it need a very comprehensive data pull as well as restructuring of how providers. And so we're not in a position where we can say to you, I can give you a full and complete data set because I don't know what issues we're going to discuss. So I would suggest that we need to have the conversation and identify potential issues, and then we can talk about what data are available and the timing as to how we could share that information. That will help us delineate between what issues are going to be in the current rate setting cycle versus future rate setting cycle. We're not in a position where we can give you a blanket data set. What we're expecting is in your position as members of the DD community and stakeholders, you will bring issues to us, and then we will work collaboratively with you to source out the data that we can use to help analyze those issues.
Hi, this is Karen Lee, and something I've learned, first of all, not ever been on one of the rate committees, so it's interesting after this many years to be at this level of detail. But I will say that one of the things that we've experienced as an early adopter is this apples and oranges idea, is that by using previous cost reports or financial data and comparing it to what you need to operate a brand new set of services under a brand new set of parameters, I think has caused some conflict for my early adopter colleagues. And so I'm concerned about using only that measure of looking at previous, and I may have missed something. You may have said that there are other options, but that is one of the biggest experiences I think that we've had is that it's a different set of definitions. It's a different fee payment system, right? The whole structure of the payment system is different. So it means that attrition and utilization and everything is quite different. So how when DDA is trying to turn the ship, how do the financial modelings also start to turn to look like where the programmatic side is trying to go?
Sure. So Karen, one of the things when I was talking about trend, I was trying to differentiate between base data from a historical period, base data from the current period, and then the future contract period. What we would describe, Karen, the early adopters experience is current experience. And so we're expecting to, as much as possible, incorporate both the historical information as well as what current experience is available as part of the early adopters, because we have the same challenge that you all have of there's a crosswalk issue between how things have done previously versus how they're doing currently. And we recognize that's a challenge. Unfortunately, as you transition a program, you always have that issue of having to crosswalk between old historical data and current information that would represent the experience of the early adopters, for instance.
So I guess just to follow up on that, I would ask, what's the transition strategy? And is there a consideration for some sort of transition strategy? I mean, we don't have to get into it now because that would be one of the prioritizations, but is consideration of a transition strategy considered?
Absolutely. And I would add, Karen, to your question, that we need to differentiate between subcomponents of that transition strategy. There are data collection, reporting issues, and payment issues, all on the financial side, that are separate from a transition strategy conversation on the operational side. So I think we want to make certain that we have a very comprehensive discussion about that transition strategy.
Steve, it's Chris. Just a quick follow-up question to my earlier point. The data collection mechanism that we're talking about that Hilltop's working on, yeah, at best, if we implemented that, and it's not possible, we implemented July 1st of 22 to gather data for FY23. That data would then be reported back by the providers sometime fall of 23 or early 24, which means we will not have any data to really kind of review based on the new format until January, February, March of 24. And that's with the assumption that we launch that tool July 1st of 22. And more likely it's going to be later than that. So we're looking at using data, or the first time we have data to be accessible for review is really for FY25 or FY26. And that's a concern.
We understand that completely, Chris. And so as part of the conversations, we would, in this, much like Karen just mentioned, in this transition period, we would be trying to identify potential data sources that we could use that would help inform that transition. We are intimately familiar, just like you guys are, with that very long lag time frame that you just described. And so we, as part of the role of the rate review advisory group, would be talking with you all about what information we could use to inform these policy decisions as this process continues to evolve. Any other questions or feedback? Really good comments. I love the realization of the very long lag time. I love the realization of needing a transition period and differentiating between the current rate setting cycle and what we can do now versus future rate setting cycles. These are all things that we need to, as a group, recognize will be our challenges. Any other feedback or comments before we transition to the next slide? Okay, hearing none, shall we roll to the next slide?
Sure. If we take a step back really quick to the last slide, I don't think we had talked about this too much yet, but just to do a quick update for various individuals who may have seen different rates or been part of different discussions across the board. Since last year, since about April of last year, there have been some changes in those components that we talked about in some of the calculations that we kind of briefly mentioned. And there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot of detail, so feel free to let us know if you have any questions, but this might be something that we'd have to discuss after the meeting if you have specific questions around these. We're really more concerned with kind of moving forward from where we are. But some of the changes that have been made, looking at wages, for example, the residential wages were assumed at the 40th percentile of the wage range of kind of the average wages for that service or for that role. And those have been increased to the 50th percentile. Reviewing things for consistency. So in some adjustments that had been made to the rates, there was some rounding and minor technical issues, making sure that those services matched each other. Budget policy has slightly shifted where there's been an overall slight increase to the budget projections, and some of the rates have been updated. Actually, I should say all of the rates have been updated to match the available funding with a funding level adjustment. There's been some enhancements to the transportation component for various services. We've made some updates to daily staff hours with DDA guidance. And so an example of that is the house size 1 for community living group homes, supported living. Those have had an increase in the daily staff hours assumptions, so that we're looking at, I think it's 138 hours per week in an overnight setting, and I think it's 82 hours per week in a without overnight setting. The brick to unit conversion, that was something that had been discussed. I'm anticipating that will be discussed a bit more as we move forward, where there was some different calculations in how we went from that per hour cost into the per unit cost. And so that has been reverted back to the original methodology with the intent to avoid any of the cost duplication that occurred with some changes that had been made. There's been additional meetings with some of the stakeholders. So since September of 2021, there's some additional updates coming to the residential hours. It's still a little bit ongoing to make sure that it best matches the operational considerations. And we've reviewed some of the rates for consistency, based on feedback from the EAG, for example, where the community development service, the group service was an inconsistent wage with the day habilitation, and those were intended to be in alignment with each other. So the CDS group service wage has been brought up to match the day hab group service. So there's a lot more detail going on, very specific here. If you have questions about those, I would suggest that you reach out to us afterwards, or we can discuss those if there's some time at the end. So I want to make sure we have some time aside here to get input on what additional things, what new things, what feedback that you guys want to share with us that we can learn from and understand. So I want to make sure we have the time for that. So if there's any quick questions on this, we could take those now. Otherwise, I think we should probably move on to the next slide and start talking about prioritization and some current or ongoing interests that we are reviewing.
Chris, I have a quick question. Those changes to FY22, if you can just flip back to the last slide for a second. I know there were discussions with the last iteration and the fishbowl discussion and all of that, but have we seen the most recent version of rates that have some of these changes or all of these changes?
I'm not sure exactly what's been shared with who, so I don't know if DDA wants to speak to that more specifically, but I will say that there are some revisions that are still being discussed, and so I think that is information that will be shared in the near future.
I think also it's just really important to note that on that slide, those are several of the issues and challenges that we do have, and so it would be really helpful to know the details behind those moving forward, because it's possible some of it has been, addressed and taken care of, but I know, being part of the rate group, I'm not really sure what those changes are that you're speaking of now. And so it probably does warrant further discussion, even if it's at another time for greater detail.
Yep, yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And as we get to in a couple slides, we'll start talking about the current interest and priorities that we are reviewing, and many of them have overlap with some of these adjustments that we've made. So those will be discussions that we're having moving forward.
Chris, just one last thing. I don't think the geographic differential and the rest of state adjustment, is that reflected in this chart at all?
No, that one was not included in this chart, but that is a good one that we made changes to that, yeah, just must have gotten missed there. All right, so it's I think probably a good idea to move on to the next slide. We can start talking about what some of the interests and priorities are going forward, and some considerations of how might be helpful to prioritize some of those interests. So I think Jennifer wanted to speak through this.
Thanks, Chris. So we're going to spend about the next 30 minutes doing a brief review of a summary of all the stakeholder input that we received prior to this group's formation. We can then hold a group discussion to validate the summary with the goal of reaching consensus on the FY23 through FY24 priorities. On this slide, you'll see some of the factors that we think should be considered when looking at the various issues that we're going to bring up and talking about how they should be prioritized. So that would be the number of individuals impacted, the number of services impacted, number of providers impacted, relevance to DDA values and focus areas, whether it should be a short-term or long-term priority, other potential impacts. And something I'd also like, given some of the discussion that's been happening, I think that we should be discussing related to these items as well, is what would the data gathering look like for these items so that we get a sense of potential timelines. So with that, turn it over to Leslie Lee from Optimus, who will now share the summary of the stakeholder rate review interests and priorities.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hi, Leslie Lee here with Optimus. I've been consulting on this project for about 3 years now, so very excited to be working with you guys again, and new people. So as Jennifer was saying, we've heard the feedback from various stakeholders and individuals, and just through our experience, we generally get feedback that is consistent, and sometimes we also get conflicting feedback. And so this is where we're looking to get your input on, as Steve has mentioned and others have mentioned, what we should be focusing on this cycle versus future cycles, and so on. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So like I said, from this group, we need to go through these issues that have been shared with us and figure out what needs to be reviewed immediately, how we can gather that data, etc. Keeping in mind some of the priorities or the frame of mind when we're considering these issues from the last slide. And also one more thing for context, one of the benefits of transitioning to this rate cycle process is that we're not creating rates that just last indefinitely. And what we don't address this time, we can carry forward and continue to improve on in future rate cycles. So with that being said, the issues that we've heard based on the latest iteration of rates, we've divided into 2 different categories. One being the rate components, which are that's specific to each of the assumptions for each of the components, such as transportation, ERE, facility. The other category of feedback we've heard is what we're categorizing as rate constructs, which address the structural design of the rate model. And so for rate components, we've heard feedback about clarifying the costs and responsibilities for transportation in the rates, understanding the attendance policies like no-shows and cancellations. We want to explore the relationship between wages and staff turnover, review the daily staff hour assumptions in the residential services. Some of that is already ongoing, but we can continue to explore that as we understand how it gets operationalized. Comparing the expected revenue and expenses for each of the group home sizes to make sure that it's appropriate. For the rate construct issues, we have validating whether rates sufficiently cover the non-billable staff time that's involved in providing the care, comparing policies of the group sizes for the day services compared to what needs to be operationalized, discuss fixed and variable cost allocations, review if the rates appropriately address varying needs among members, which Laura referred to as acuity. And then considering difficulties in transitioning to a new system, as Karen had mentioned, and then discussing the details behind the employment rate development or employment services rate development. So those are the issues that we've heard so far. And as Steve had mentioned, every cycle we intend to start with a list of feedback we've heard, solicit any additional feedback that stakeholders would like the state to consider. And then in follow-up meetings, we would like to share back the agreed upon priorities and then discuss strategies on how to review or gather data and address these issues.
I have a question. So because these are showing up here, do we assume that they have not been corrected in the April 22 release of rates?
These are, I think, topics that are up for discussion still. So I think that some of these, there have been adjustments to them. For example, the daily staff hour assumptions in residential services that we've worked with DDA and state on trying to make sure that that best matches the operational needs. but that is something that we had discussed with various stakeholders in the past and hasn't necessarily had a resolution with those stakeholders. So that's something we'd kind of want to bring to the table, for example, and say, this is what we've done, this is why we've done it, this is what we think it addresses, and get your feedback on whether you think that's appropriate, whether it's missing the mark anywhere. But these would be things that may have been addressed to some degree, but are kind of ongoing topics.
This is Karen. So Karen Adams-Gilchrist. So would these things be addressed before the go live rates in April?
That's it may be a difficult question. It might depend on the specific issue here, but I think many of these are things that we're trying to kind of start our new process here, developing how we want to address these, how we want to discuss these. Again, keeping in mind that, we're not saying that we're making one set of final rates and that's it, but that this is going to be an ongoing cycle with updates and maintenance moving forward. So I think some of these may be addressed, but I don't think that all of these would be completely resolved, I would say, before April.
Thank you, Chris.
Chris, this is Greg. Did you guys by any chance look at credentialing or certification of DSPs in any of the formulas? Is that something that was even on the radar screen?
That is something that was considered in terms of training and the training assumptions. But if that's a concern or an issue that you think is important, I think that's something that we could discuss in more detail and provide more information on.
Great. I love your list, and I'm really I want to be as respectful as I possibly can be. Exploring the relationship between wages and staff turnover. I can tell you what that is, as you well know. The lower they are, the higher it is. But if we can really effectively speak into some of these issues collaboratively to find out where those sweet spots are moving forward, I think that would be beneficial to all of us, obviously.
To Greg's point, in the previous slide, you didn't have any change about that, but I know when the brick was originally built, the brick did have career pathways in it, and it was taken out. And I don't know if it was taken out since 21, but it has been taken out. It was originally in there, and it has been taken out. So putting that back in from the original calculation would be definitely a high priority.
Yeah, I agree with you, Karen.
This is all great feedback, and part of the reason why we wanted to have the advisory group was to be able to capture this feedback. And so DDA and OCM, Office of Change Management, are capturing these discussions and the feedback so that we can make certain that we're cataloging these discussions and we can address them as we move forward. Really helpful.
Steve, to that point, as I've attended the meeting today, and you guys have done a great job, I've been a little bit confused as to when I should talk or when I shouldn't, because whether you were trying to get through a specific agenda and understanding that the longer term goal of the commission, I believe, is to really get as much great information to be considered as possible. Would it be, I'm just wondering, maybe something to consider, and maybe you've already done this in future meetings, is to actually have a set aside time just to talk about some of those concerns rather than feeling like we're either restrained or we have to bring it up in a particular part of an agenda where we may be taking either you off topic or going down a rabbit hole. So just an observation.
Great feedback. Appreciate it.
And I'd say for this particular meeting, this is the perfect time to bring up all of those issues, because we want to both kind of get some feedback on this list and hear about other issues, pain points that you all want us to take under consideration as well.
I wanted to jump in. I realized that I think there's a whole kind of knot of issues around the FY23 rates, the data analysis, their adequacy. And so I know that the list we're looking at of rate components and rate construct, you know, partially came from earlier discussions of rates before this group started, and I think the early adopters, and I think they're all really good points. But I think what's missing is, particularly for 23, but probably as an ongoing discussion, is are the rates adequate? And I don't think, I mean, I know it's in the overall goal, but in terms of what we need to be looking at, again, particularly I think for 23, is what's happening in terms of adequacy. And I think everybody knows there's one area in particular we're very concerned about that relates to the meaningful day rates.
And just kind of to follow up to Laura's point, I mean, providers are looking at trying to make business decisions. There are definitely some of these issues that we need to address prior to FY23, or providers could be making assumptions based on wrong rates.
Well, and just, I mean, I've had 2 providers call me in the last year and say based on rates they had seen at a point, they were closing their day programs. And we said, don't do that. Please don't do that yet. Don't make a decision yet. But providers will make those kinds of decisions. So we need to be looking at that.
So out of this list that you see and some of the other things that we've talked about, I mean, what are the items that you think should be the biggest focus areas to try to plan to implement in FY23? Why don't we start there, and we can talk a bit about what data would it take to get us there?
Well, can I just say, I think the overall analysis by Hilltop is, you know, I assume going to give us a sense of where, you know, how the rates are playing out for providers. And, you know, when I look back at the prioritization of rate review interests, I think they're good discussion points, but I'll give you an example. Number of services impacted is one that's on there, which it is true that is an important thing to contemplate, but you could also have one service that is deeply affected to the point where it may not be sustainable, and that's not really reflected on that list of prioritization. So maybe that, you know, something about the severity of impact could be included on that slide, the previous slide. And then I think, you know, a timely sense of what Hilltop is seeing from the fiscal impact data is really important.
I have a comment. I think your question on where the priorities is, you know, an excellent question, and we need to answer that question. But I have a sense that we really, as a group, don't have a whole lot of time on this, and it goes back to Steve's, you know, one of his earliest charts. You know, we're going to meet monthly, and now this group is seeing this list, which is a very good list, and you're asking a realistic question: what's the priority? But there isn't a lot of time for thought. There's not a lot of time for adding some things, and we're going to meet again in March. So it just, you know, causing a question a little bit for me is, you know, the value that you really expect to get from this group, given the timelines that we're on and how to respond to these things. These are big issues, and how to pick one of them. You know, how to I couldn't prioritize this in the next 5 minutes. So I don't know. To me, that's more of a process question.
So we're definitely not asking for you all to prioritize in the next 5 minutes, although we certainly want to hear any initial thoughts you have. As you're going to see and later as we wrap up this meeting, we've also created a Google form for you to be able to submit additional feedback before the next meeting as you think through some of this more. So this is definitely not your only chance to provide feedback.
Yeah, I even hesitated to say that because we haven't seen the whole presentation, and maybe there's, like you say, areas that we'll have a chance to work on this.
So this is Sharon, and I guess I would kind of going back to one slide prior in terms of the factors that may drive some of the prioritization process. I would agree with Laura's comment about the number of services and being careful about that. I would also suggest that we need to be careful about the number of people affected, because I think it's really more about, are there things that are affecting people disproportionately in particular parts of the system, and keeping equity in mind. I know that in our conversations and our process, one of, again, the things that is challenging about this particular transition between the matrix rates and the future rates is this move from a largely acuity-based approach to an approach that doesn't really factor in acuity. And so I think being aware of also equity and disproportionality in terms of impacts is going to be an important part of the conversation. So I guess I would just ask for a finer point on that issue of how many people are affected, because it's not just about the total number of people who are affected by a particular set of rates.
I would add that the exploring relationships between wages and turnover, that's where I would put the career pathways. We have the data, we have the framework, we have, Department of Labor has partnered with us to create and we have, lots of information on that at the national level. It's certainly something I know that ACL is focused on right now, as well as the Department of Labor, and talk about impacting 100% of the services provided. So I would vote for the exploring relationships between wages, turnover, and then add to that the career pathways as a solution, credentialing and career pathways as a solution to that, with increased wages for increased credential, which may be a nice paint over all of the issues.
Jennifer, this is Chris Parks. I think they're all priorities. I think that we have to establish which ones are at the top of the list. For me, it has to be the items that are those foundational pieces. Anything that could potentially change how we're calculating the brick, or a fundamental change to that concept, at least from a calculation perspective. Acuity is definitely one of them. The fixed versus the variable cost too. Changes there could trickle upward to significant change in numbers and change in output. So I think we've got to start at the foundation. All of these items are important, but there's foundational pieces. The ones that can change other components have got to be our first priority.
I would add the non-billable time. There's a difference between the cost factor and the billable time factor.
When I look at this list, I think of it as really the top priorities based on what was actually originally a longer list. I think it was kind of culled into this more focused list. So I'm not sure I would prioritize within this group of I think this, personally, I think this is the prioritized list.
I'm kind of at the same place as Laura. This might be this is Karen Adams-Gilchrist. This might be the prioritized list. Also, I think Chris Welch, I think you said that some of these things have been fixed, but we just haven't seen that yet. It would be great to know what has been fixed that might help us figure out where the priorities are if we know that some things have been taken care of and that they are adequate and sufficient and make sense. That would be great. It might help us in figuring out what is the priority in this list.
Yeah, I think it goes back to knowing what those FY22 rate adjustments were done on the prior slide.
And I would add that if there's a way to have that information before the March meeting, it would be really helpful given the short timeline.
Yeah.
I would agree. I would actually
that makes
like
sense.
to see the actual brick calculations themselves, if they could be made available to the advisory group.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
I think that's really helpful feedback. I just want to help kind of frame some of this discussion as we're moving into it, because it gets a little bit complicated. If we think of it in terms of, did we get the rates right? The only way that we could kind of know that is if we had some benchmark to say, yes, these rates are right, and we can check if it matches that benchmark. What we're trying to do is trying to project whether we think it's most likely adequate, whether it's kind of covering everything. So I just want to keep that in mind as we talk about things like the hour assumptions in the residential services. Those have fluctuated based on various input from various groups, and there's been different attempts to try to best match what we think is likely or what we think is expected moving forward. But there's not really going to be any way to know, yes, that rate is exactly right. I think the closest we're going to get is what Laura had mentioned with those provider impact studies. We can start to see maybe there's a huge issue in potentially day providers where those rates are really causing them to have concerns about closing down, or maybe there seems to be an excess in some other service where maybe the assumptions were too high and that needs to get addressed. It's difficult to say kind of what's a right and wrong rate. It's really more of how are things evolving and how are we going to try our best to estimate what it looks like going forward.
Chris, I have a question to that point, and I don't remember who it was. It might have been you that got a comment in here about when adjustments had to be made. Some of it was based on the resources that were available. So if you assume that the resources that are available can help you get it right, that may be a flawed assumption. And so I think that's part of the challenge. We've been on the early adopter side, and then as rates have evolved, we've seen a massive shift in some of those rates. And, I don't think we want to go through a specific list, but, a big catalog of what we do in a very rural county is four-person homes. Four-person homes, I would add, where everybody has their own bedroom and most have their own bathroom. So it's not a tight, it's part of our geography. When you looked at the available resource, how did that affect the rates in terms of the downward pressure that put on the rates? Because again, I can tell you, I can show you what we will look like next year in that line of business with these rates, and it's not pretty. So, but if you don't have more money to throw at it, you know what I mean? It's not like we have unlimited resources. So where did that play in? Is there any way to quantify how that played in, that when you looked at the big picture, you went, oh my God, we're $50 million short or $100 million short. How did that play into your work?
I think that's a very valuable and valid question. That's, I think, going to be something that we need to discuss in later meetings where we get into the details of each of these. I think for today, we want to try to keep the focus on what things have we captured that we want to take back and make considerations about and be able to discuss in more detail. What things might we have missed that you want to provide additional feedback on. So certainly that 4-person home is one that we've heard very, from multiple providers there, and that's something that we can discuss in a little bit more detail as we, review some of these priorities and interests in future meetings.
Okay.
Scott, again, I think you have this, well, I'm sure you have this covered, but I just want to repeat it, that one of my concerns is the people with the most support needs. And I think we have that as acuity. But when I've done the analysis for my people that we support, I lose money as soon as the person starts to get more and more support needs. So it's on there. I just want to emphasize.
No, I second what Scott said. That's also something that we're seeing, especially with the need to add more nursing and things along those lines, that we're seeing that as a challenge as well.
So Scott and Shauna, that's really helpful. That's something that there has been some discussion on that in the past, but I'm just wondering if you can provide a little bit more context on whether it's certain services that you're seeing that impact or certain settings, so that we could kind of look at targeting that a little bit more clearly.
Well, I did a quick and dirty on the report, the form that we sent all into you, and then compared my matrix scores. The day services are losing about 14% of revenue in the conversion from PCIS to LTSS, and of that 14%, 13% of that is for related to people with a matrix score of 5 or higher in the support side. So it's, the people that are losing the money in the conversion are people with a rating of 5 or higher, and it's a significant impact. Now, will I deal with it in some fashion the best I can? Absolutely, but that's the first thing.
That's what we're seeing with the individuals with the higher matrix scores also with the conversion.
Okay,
Chris,
yeah, that's super helpful. Oh,
this is Chris. I can really kind of add some information to that. I actually looked at the LTSS rates versus the existing rates just for the 3- and 4-person homes for the geographic and non-geographic regions. Excuse me. And ultimately, our starting point, and I go back to the word foundation. Our foundation, to me, seems a little flawed when the over 50% of the individuals that are in 3-person with overnight, 4-person with overnight for the non-geographic, and 4-person overnight for the geographic are all receiving less funding. More than 50% of the people receive less base funding to start. And we're solving that through the use of dedicated hours. Seems like a flawed starting point to me. We're pushing people, and I know we've got the acuity piece there to discuss, but we are putting providers in a position of deciding whether to serve complex individuals or serve individuals with less needs. And I think that we're putting ourselves in a position long-term that is not advantageous.
Can someone unmute Ken? He wanted to chime in.
Hey, Donna, he's self-muted, so I'm not sure how to do that on this end. Can you go to where the camera, and above that there's a little mic and it's orange? Can you click it to see if it turns green?
It looks like he's unmuted now. No? Nope.
Oh, it still shows here it is. He's there. Yep.
I'm not sure if anyone else is having a problem, but I'm not able to hear Ken if he's speaking right now. I just want to say I appreciate that input from Scott and Chris and Shauna, giving us some more context around the details there, and we can certainly talk about those in more detail in those future meetings as we start, really working through this rather than just kind of the high-level overview.
I see Ken typing.
If we move to the next slide, that was really what we had this was intended for our time for discussion.
Do you mind if we give him one more minute?
Yeah, it just takes a little extra time.
Yeah, that's totally fine. I was just going to say on the next slide, this is really our time for group discussion. And we do have that forms link there, or if if you need to reach out in a different way, if there's any issues here, we want to make sure we're capturing all of that. So if there's any technical issues today or right now, we want to make sure that we have the opportunity to get all that feedback.
Ken, do you think it's ready to go? No?
I think he's having some technology issues because Ken was hoping we could hear him.
And this is Carrie. Would it be helpful if you emailed it off and we could read it to the group? If you have it up on your screen and you want to just send it over, I'm happy to read it to folks.
Or you can text it to me if you want, whatever is easy. Ken's question is this also for people who self-direct? And Ken, I'm going to look to see if you can, you mean the rates, the prioritization?
Yeah, that's helpful if we can get more specifics, but I think the intent here is to make sure that we are, appropriately covering everything for people who self-direct as well. Certainly, there's no intention to leave that behind.
Rates. His question is, are these the rates for people who self-direct as well?
So, yeah, I don't know if the state wants to speak to that in any more detail, but I believe we just have the geographic rates and the non-geographic, the standard rates would be applicable for everyone.
Okay, Ken said thanks. All right, I think we're, yeah, I was gonna say, I think we're okay to move forward.
So I think we've gotten a lot of great feedback here. So thank you to everyone for everything that you've had to say. I think you've given us a lot of good things to think about. Going back to what Chris was saying earlier, we do want to continue to receive your feedback in between this meeting and the March meeting. So please use this Google Forms link to send in any more of your thoughts that you have between now and then. Certainly understand that there might be things as you think about it more that you want to make sure we take into consideration. So on our next slide, we have some information about next steps for this process. Meetings will occur monthly, February until September, and will be posted on DDA's training calendar. We'll make meeting minutes available following each meeting. Members of the public who would like to observe will be able to register through the DDA website. And I think the other thing that we'll also take back is how we can make more extensive information available to you all ahead of a meeting, so that there, in future meetings, there will be more specifics to talk from. I think with that, thank you again, everyone. Unless there are any final comments or concerns about logistics, I think we will wrap for today.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good weekend.
Just before we drop, just one last quick note. As we talked earlier in the meeting, this will be an open meeting. And so the DDA does have a dedicated page for all these materials. So the recordings and the meeting minutes will all be posted. So Donna, if you could just go down to slide 25, just to give folks a quick visual as to where things are so that the community that's participating today, as well as our members, will be able to see how to access those materials. One more. Thank you. So here you'll see a quick image of the DDA's website and where you can find access to all of these materials. So LTSS Maryland in the top banner, and then click off to the right. There's a button for the LTSS rates and the rate review advisory group. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.